Thanks. So I hope you guys can stand another talk about how to style a button with rocket science, because that's what it's mainly about. Yeah, welcome to my talk, CSS is dead, long live CSS, button modules please. So before I start, I want to ask you the question, so what makes working with CSS hard? Because every developer usually hates CSS, they don't like working with it. And what's the problem? Well, the problem is that in CSS land, in CSS land, the globals are everywhere, right? And you cannot not do global, because everything is global by default. And as we all know, global state makes developers really sad, right? And there's no real solution to that problem. There are some workarounds like deep nesting, but you know, when you start deep nesting your selectors, when you get to the third level, it starts like being the stairway to hell, how I like to call it. So that's not a real solution. There are some architecture guidelines like BEM, SMAX, OOCSS, and you know, they work kind of, but it's a lot of stuff to write usually, and it's hard to get everybody in the team on board and that everybody really uses that stuff. And you know, you have to be really strict about that it actually works. And then there are some preprocessors like SAS and LAS. They make it easier to write BEM, for example, and they help you with stuff like variables. But all of them, they do not really solve the problem of global state, right? They just make it manageable or easier or bearable, how you want to call it. So the question is, JS had like the same problems a few years ago, right? So when you think back like JS development 10 years ago, jQuery and stuff, everything was global. You had to, you know, you added a third-party library, everything broke, because everything was global there too. But today, this problem is mostly solved in JavaScript, right? So what killed the globals in JavaScript? And the answer to that is probably Webpack and NPM, because now instead of globals, there are modules everywhere in JavaScript land, right? And so can we actually apply the same concept of modules that we did with JavaScript to CSS? And let's just start like a little thought experiment. So we install Bootstrap via NPM, which is possible. And then we just want to import the style sheet, not like the JavaScript files, but the style sheet. And let's say that by importing a style sheet as a module, we get like a local reference to that style sheet. So the style sheet is not added to the page. We just import it in our JavaScript file. We get a local reference to it. And all those class names in the style sheet are local by default. So there are no global class names anymore. They are all local. And then the challenge is, since CSS only knows global, right? We need a way to get back to global, but in a kind of safely way, so that we don't have all the problems that we usually have with global style sheets. And how does it actually look like when importing such a CSS file? Well, the style sheet module that you get is just an object with a mapping from your local style sheets, like button, local class names, like button primary, to this weird looking random number. And this will be our global class name. So the chance that there's a conflict is like very minimal, right? But in fact, this one is not really random. The idea is that the global class name is derived from the local class name in the style sheet and like properties of the style sheet, like the path, where does it live, and then you hash that. And then you get like a weird looking thing, but it's not random. It's actually deterministic. So, and then we can use local class names across style sheets, and the hash they generate will be different because it lives in another style sheet. And in the end, the style sheet that will get added to the document will consist of all the global generated class names. Here's another example, because that's like the most important part about CSS modules that you have to understand. So let's say you have two style sheets, one is dialog CSS, one is form CSS, and you want to use like your button class name in both style sheets, and you don't want to have like dialog __ button or something like that. And when you import both of them, the output for the global class name will be different. even though the local class name is the same, they live in another style sheet, so the global class name for both of those classes will be different. And now the question is, so how can we actually use that, right? And yes, there's Vim on it, and it's use it. Okay, first we need to set up Webpack, and it's actually quite easy because the only thing you need is the CSS loader, and the important part is like this module parameter which enables CSS modules for this loader, and that's basically everything you need to start actually using it. And okay, once again, we import our style sheet. So this is like a full-blown example. And then we want to do a button, which uses those style sheets. And how we do it? Well, we just create our button component. And to get like the reference to the global class names, because that's what we need in the end to add to the component, we look them up in the style sheet object, right? And we want to have button and button primary. We concatenate those class names or the global class names to get like the final class name, add it to our component like we are used to, and we are basically done. And then we render our component, and the output will look something like that, which, you know, is nice because we get like safe global class names, but you might be, okay, so what about the developer experience, right? This is really hard to develop if everything looks like a random hash in your DOM. And well, I care about developer experience a lot, so there's like a development setup for this kind of stuff. And the CSS loader has like this local ident name query parameter that you can use to specify how this hash is generated, or if you actually want to use a hash. And instead of a hash, we can say, okay, our global class name should consist of the path of the style sheet, the name of the style sheet, and our local class name that we specified in the style sheet. And the output will then look something like this. So it lives in Node modules bootstrap dist, right? The name of the CSS file is bootstrap, and our local class name was button or button primary. So this is way better for development. I hope everyone agrees with that. And I hope now you'll be like, okay, that's awesome. But wait, if I have like unit tests, do I actually have to bundle my unit tests now before running them? Which everyone knows is really slow, right? And the good answer to that is that there's another solution to that problem, which I call the unit test setup. And so let's say you have like the button, you import it, and you use Enzyme for testing or whatever. And this is probably how your test should look like. So you want your button to just test class button and button primary. So you don't want to deal with the global class names. You just want to test for the local class names, right? And the other problem is that your test will throw a runtime error because Node doesn't know how to import CSS files, right? It will just say, yeah, I don't know about that. How do I do it? And the answer to that is that there's a CSS Modules requirehook, which enables you to require CSS files in Node during runtime. And it also has like this nice generate scope name parameter, which is the same as the local ident name parameter that we just saw for the CSS loader. And that too allows you to override how the hash is generated. And for unit testing, we just don't want any kind of hash or something like that. We just want the local name. So we just can test for that. And the good news is if you do it like that, and you have existing unit tests and you want to switch over to CSS modules, there's like a really high chance that you don't need to change anything about your unit tests, which is really awesome. And so the last missing piece is how do we actually get our style sheet into our document in the end? And the answer is style loader for Webpack. And you just prepend it to your CSS loader, and then everything gets rendered as an inline style in your head of the document. And if you actually want to get a CSS file out of it in the end, you can use the extract text Webpack plugin, which you know, scraps all the styles from the document and actually writes it to a CSS file. And there's 2 steps to actually do that. You have to add the extract text plugin loader, and you have to define the plugin. And you can define what the output CSS file should be named, and you can add some other stuff, or you can also split it into chunks if you want to. So that's everything possible, but that's like the basic setup to actually do that. Cool. So that's not all there is to it. There's like some better stuff that comes with those things. And the first one I want to talk about is like, how does this integrate with React in a better way? So if you think back about our button implementation, this part is really ugly, right? You have to define like this variable, and then you have to look up the styles, and you have to concatenate strings, and if you have like a typo in there somewhere, you get undefined in your class name. So this sucks, right? Nobody wants to do that. And if you want to add like some other property, if you get like class name property from your parent component in your component, and you want to add this too, you have to do like that. It just feels weird. And you can use ES6, string concatenation or template strings, but it looks even weirder than that. So there should be a better way to do that. And the answer is like this. Oh, sorry. The React CSS Modules higher order component. And what this does, so it's a higher order component. So we get a reference to it by importing it. And here we just say, okay, wrap our button and use our style sheet that we just imported. And what we actually do now in our button is that instead of using class name to use those local classes, we use style name. And in style name, we can just write button and button primary. And what the higher order component does is it basically looks up those local class names in the style sheet that we pass it and adds them to the class name behind. And basic idea is that for global class names that we may still have, or other classes that get passed down from the parent, we use class name, and for all the local stuff, we use style name. And we have like this nice distinction, and it's way easier to read, and you don't have the hassle of actually concatenating class names. As a bonus, during runtime, if you have like a typo somewhere and you write bouton instead of button or whatever, it throws an error in the developer console, and you get like direct feedback that you have a typo somewhere or that something was deleted from a CSS file, which is really nice. The other thing that comes with CSS modules is composition. So if you use like less or Sass, you're probably used to that. It's just another syntax, but you don't need those anymore if you just want to do composition. So the idea is we define a button and with background and color and maybe some other stuff. And for our button primary, we just want to override like the background. And then we just use this new composes keyword and say, okay, compose button and override the background. This works in the same file, and we can also import stuff or compose stuff from other files. When we say, okay, we are now in dialog CSS, and we want to have a dialog button with another background color, so we say, okay, compose the button style from the button CSS file, and overwrite the background. That's really nice. You can also do like multiple composes inside the class. But it's really simple, but it's usually sufficient for what you need. And there's also value variables. I think there was a question about that. And it's not directly in the CSS module spec. You need the post-CSS values plugin for that, but it works without hassle. And the idea is that you have like a colors file where you define all your colors. And in your button CSS, you basically import those colors from those files, and then you, like all the colors, and then you say, okay, we want gray, white, and blue from this color object. So that's like the syntax for it. It's a bit different than less or Sass, but it still works really well, and then you can just use those names that you defined here. So this is not actually like the CSS white anymore. The CSS gray is actually those values that we get from the colors file. You can use those for all kind of values. It's not as powerful as like the Sass variant, where you can do like some weird eval stuff in those and everything, but it's probably better to keep it simple like that. And it works. And it's not hard. So if you are in the dire need and still need global styles for whatever reason, like you have like those third-party components like a date picker or Highlight.js, or you have RTE content, and you still need to define global styles to override things, you don't need to create like a new CSS file for that. You can use the global keyword in your CSS module. And the idea is, this is like a local class name editor, and if you want to have it global, you just prepend the global keyword. And the output will look like that. So our editor is still hashed, and our HLJS class name will be just the same as we defined here because nothing will be changed. That's really simple. It's like a safety hatch if you actually need it, but you should keep this as, use this as little as possible because it just invalidates the stuff that we just did. So, okay, another cool thing about CSS modules is Minification. So if you have like this huge CSS library like Bootstrap, you probably don't need everything, right? You just maybe need buttons, some typography stuff, maybe a label, form elements, whatever. But all the other stuff, dialogues, you probably don't need them. So instead of importing everything out of Bootstrap, we just want like buttons, right? And the sad thing is this probably doesn't work with Bootstrap. I haven't tried it. I tried it with some other libraries. I think it works with pure CSS because they split their code base really nicely without like dependencies. But you can still work around it by creating a local SAS file, import everything that you need, and then only use that. And when everything gets bundled by Webpack, they just use the buttons.less file and not the whole Bootstrap file. So instead of having like 100 kilobyte of CSS, you just have 10 or something like that. This is really, really nice. And you should make use of that if you use CSS modules. The another nice thing is it works actually really flawlessly with everything else that you might think of or that you have in your toolchain, like preprocessors. If you want to use this with SAS, you just have to add the SAS loader at the end. If you want to use this with post-CSS, you just have to add post-CSS loader. You can also use SAS and post-CSS. You can also use linters with CSS modules because it's just CSS, right? So everything works how it should. But always remember to keep it simple. Like just because you can use it, you probably don't need everything. So don't use everything just because you can. It's usually a bad idea. Okay, now there's like this other movement lately, which is called CSS and JS that Johannes talked about. And I think there's like this battle between CSS modules and CSS and JS because they want to do the same thing, but they do it in a different way. And that's like a short section about this, and it contains like a personal opinion, so take everything with a grain of salt. Okay, what actually is CSS and JS? Well, the idea was first proposed in late 2014 by Vijay. He's a Facebook guy who works with React. And there was like this huge discussion that started after his talk. And the basic idea is that they also want to eliminate global state in CSS, but by writing the CSS in JavaScript, right? So you can have all your nice JavaScript features like variables and local scope and stuff like that. And then use that to render the CSS as inline styles. That was the basic idea. And there were like really a lot of implementations that followed. Michele Bertolli, who's also here somewhere, has like this nice overview on his GitHub repository. I can just show it for a second, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so that's like the list of all the implementations, and that's a lot, right? And I think that's like the main problem I have with it, that there's no definite solution at the moment or definite implementation, and all different implementations have like some problems. The problem that I have, or the biggest problem I have with this, is that there's no good tooling for writing CSS and JavaScript, right? All the editors don't know what you're actually doing. They don't know that this is CSS and not JS. And if you lose like camel case for your class names, it gets really awkward to write. And I'm not a big fan of that. Also, inline styles don't support all the CSS features, like pseudo elements or animations, also difficult to do. And they generate really a lot of bloat in your DOM. So if you actually used it and looked at the DOM, you're like, okay, that's a lot of inline styles. Also, there's no reuse of existing CSS, because if you want to reuse CSS that you already have in your project, you actually have to convert it in JavaScript, which is a lot of work usually. And there are some more sophisticated solutions that try to solve those new problems. But in my opinion, this adds too much complexity to your project. And depending on your team, it's really hard to get everyone on board to the idea. And I don't know, I don't think that it's currently in a state where you actually want to use it in a production scale application. But you actually can, play around with all the stuff and try it yourself, get a feeling for it. So for me, I didn't like it. But I think everyone has to decide for himself if they want to use it. Also, if you have any more questions about CSS and JS, I think Michele is happy to answer all your questions about that later. Okay, actually I'm quite fast. So when should you actually use CSS modules? I mean, they are nice, but there are probably some good fits and some bad fits for this technology, like everything. So it works really well if you have like single-page applications with like a modular UI, and if you use React anyway and you have Webpack set up, it's so simple to add to your project that it's, I don't know, maybe a bad thing even not to do it. If you have like a component or UI library that you open source somewhere, you can actually use local CSS in CSS modules in your library, and it works really well. I did that too, and it was no problem at all. And maybe for bigger front-end teams, especially when you have like artists contribute CSS, and it's usually hard to explain artists how to structure the CSS files and BEM and all that stuff. And so it's probably easier to just get the CSS from the artist, add it as a local module, and they don't overwrite your other stuff in your code base. So this is really nice. You don't have to refactor what you get from the artist. They can contribute easily. So that's like the biggest good fits for CSS modules. And then you have like bad fits. Like if you have a CMS project or something like that, it's usually a bad idea to use that because it just doesn't make any sense in that context. So if you have simple campaign websites with a lot of animations and a lot of pling and stuff like that, it's usually better to just give it to some web agency that throw out the CSS and be done with it. My personal experience with CSS modules. So I wrote an open source web component library for the Office UI fabric, completely with CSS modules. So the Office UI fabric, they basically had all the CSS ready with Sass. And what I did was, just as I showed it with the Bootstrap example, I imported all the Sass files in my components and just used what I actually needed. And it worked really well, even though they didn't think about using it as CSS modules when they wrote their CSS, right? But it just worked. Sadly, I had to deprecate it because Microsoft released their own version of that library and they just have more manpower, so that's kind of sad. I also modulified like parts of one internal project with CSS modules, and it wasn't really that hard to do, and now it uses this mix of local and global CSS, but it works really well. So all the dump components have their own CSS files, and then we have some more global CSS for general styling, typography, stuff like that, and really good. And then like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I wrote 2 small Outlook add-ins, also in React, and I just used CSS modules completely, nothing else. And it also worked like really, really good. And I'm a big fan. So yeah, actually I'm really short, but that's actually it. So I hope you have a lot of questions because we have a lot of time left.